Welcome to Greg Hjorth's Greatest Hits, etc. The following game is a game between Greg Hjorth and Robert Byrne, played in the first round of the New York Open in 1984. In 1984, Greg Hjorth made his one and only attempt at being a chess professional. He travelled the world playing a series of high-level tournaments, including the Aura tournament in the Netherlands. He played extremely well. I think he played 6 tournaments during his trip, and in 4 of them he achieved performance ratings of around the 2500 mark. Doesn't sound like that much today. It would be the equivalent of playing at about 2700. So the level he was playing was very good. When he finally finished, everyone congratulated him on his successes, and he said no, this life was really not for him, and that he didn't like a number of things, the travel. He certainly didn't stay in salubrious places. He also said he felt a bit guilty about having to use his dad's credit card when he ran out of money, and he just decided the life of a chess professional was not for him. So he went where the big money was, and that was into mathematics, and he became a pure mathematician. But okay, for a while Greg Hjorth was a chess professional, and quite a successful one. Round 1 of the New York Open, he ran into Robert Byrne. Robert Byrne was a long-time chess columnist for the New York Times, one of America's top players from the Fischer era, and also heavily outrated Hjorth in this game. I think Byrne was a candidate at one point 10 years before this game was played, lost in the candidates to Boris Spassky. He also maintained a rating at or close to the top 100 when this game was played. So the game started e4, c5, b3, a Hjorth favourite. Now, Greg Hjorth was famous for slightly offbeat lines, but b3 was one line that he actually managed to popularise. Certainly, after sitting next to him at a number of tournaments, both Darryl Johansson and myself both started playing b3, or the variation knight f3, e6, b3, which we felt was a little bit stronger. Byrne played knight c6, bishop b2, and now e6, which is probably not the greatest move. e5 is the real test, excuse me, after which probably Hjorth would have gone for the strange King's Gambit idea, f4, which is not that great, but certainly has had success for Greg and other players. After e6, knight f3, well, knight f6 is playable by Byrne. One of the problems for black here is if you play d6 after d4, cd4, knight d4, you actually have a not great version of the Sicilian. So for example, d6, d4, pawn takes, knight takes. And for example, people have played bishop d7, but after knight b5, queen b8, there's various tactical ideas here. Is g7 hanging immediately? Probably not, but bishop a3 is very strong. And if d5, you can even take on d5, because queen check, bishop e2, and losing the rook in the corner doesn't matter because white has the c6 knight hanging and knight c7 as well. So knight f6 by Byrne. It's quite radical, especially knight g4. Knight d5 has been played by players like Judith Polgar, of course after this game. Here, moves like queen e2 are possible, even h3 immediately, but Hjorth decided to play g3. A little bit strange, but he actually wants to put the bishop on h3 rather than a pawn. I think h3 is probably a better move. Bishop e7, bishop h3, and rather than come back to h6, Byrne plays h5, which isn't a bad move, but it means that the black king won't be safe in some later positions. So Hjorth castles, b6, and now he's very undogmatic. Immediately switches back with bishop g2, bishop b7, gets rid of the knight, and then plays d4. So he's trying to create some sort of initiative. Certainly black can take on d4 here, and he shouldn't be doing too badly. He played queen c7, which looks a bit dangerous because of Hjorth's excellent reply d5. You pretty well have to take it, and then knight c3. So that knight's coming in either to d5 or to b5. Byrne tried to hang on to his pawn and play queen d8, but after c3 things are getting a little bit tricky. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and now it's not easy to see how black can develop. Of course black can castle, but at some point there's going to be a knight f6 check, also things like queen d2 or queen d3, keeping the knight on h6 in a box. So it's a position you actually see now in modern chess from a line of the Queen's Indian, and people nowadays have realised that even though you've got no direct threats, it's very difficult for black to develop. And this game is almost the precursor of it. In fact, Byrne played knight b4 because he really wanted to resolve things, but in fact he's getting into big trouble now, and Hjorth immediately pounced with knight f6 check. And already Byrne is in serious trouble. White is simply getting the pawn back, but also the black king is going to be knocked around a bit. So if you take the knight, we just take back, and then rook e1 check, and you're in big trouble. So he played king f8, knight takes pawn check. He'd like to play king back to e8, because then knight f6 check wouldn't work so well, but unfortunately white has the move e6, and then bishop takes g7. So if king goes to e8, then e6, and well, there's problems. So Byrne put his king on g8, and after bishop takes knight and queen d3, it turns out the knight on d7, although it's got no retreat, it also is very difficult to attack, and white is just going to put a rook on d1. So for example, if bishop c6 here, rook d1, and you can play an endgame, but it'll be a very favourable endgame for white. And Byrne, being the high-rated player, certainly doesn't want to do that. He wants to play rook c3 and get a counter-attack. So rook d1, rook up, queen e2, and queen a8. And Byrne is finding quite a creative way to fight back. And here's probably the only serious error by Hjorth in this game. If he'd played e6 here, then there are serious problems for black. The point is that if you take the knight on f3 after e6, then say bishop takes f3, then you take on f7, and no matter how black plays it, he's going to lose back the piece, because if he takes with the knight, then queen takes e7 will be possible after taking on f3 first, and if you take back with the king, there's a knight e5 check, probably after taking on f3 first. So, this should be good for white. Instead, Hjorth played the simple move knight e1, and after h4, it's getting a little bit tricky here. Certainly there's some counter-attack for Byrne. To his credit, Hjorth doesn't lose control. He plays g4, which is a nice idea. Bishop takes knight takes rook h3, and then goes for e6. And here is probably the last chance for Byrne to stay in the game. And actually, if he'd found f6 or f5, keeping the centre closed, the position may well turn out to be completely okay for black. Remembering, of course, that once black moves his rook out of the way, h3, h2 can be very dangerous. The problem for Byrne was that after he played rook c3, threatening h3, knight f4 is very quick. And here, we're suddenly threatening to take on f7, and with queen e6 check and this sort of thing, it's dangerous. So h3 was played. Now if we take on f7, black will take back with the knight, and you can't take the bishop on e7 because of h2 check, but simply by blocking that diagonal with knight d5, Byrne is left fairly helpless. So pawn check king h1 is sensible, because at least the knight on d5 is pinned now, but it's not permanently pinned because white can play f3 at any time, and white is constantly threatening to take on f7. So he tried moving the bishop, but then e7 is very strong. Now if you block with the queen on e8, we can just take that rook on c3 if we want to. So he tried bringing the rook back, and there are various good moves here for white. But the simplest was the one that Hjorth played, f3, threatening knight c7 actually, followed by pawn equals queen. So the king ran away, check, g6, queen e5, and there's all sorts of problems here. Threats with knight f6 check, with queen takes g5, and of course the knight on d5 is not pinned. Byrne desperately played knight takes g4 with the idea that at least the knight on d5 can't move, but white doesn't need it so much anymore. Rook across, f6, take, and Byrne finally resigned because he is a piece down and getting mated. So that was the biggest upset of the New York Open of '84. Hjorth went on to draw with players like Sam Reshevsky and prove that this wasn't a fluke, and ultimately performed extremely well. But beating a player like Byrne was a huge upset back in '84. You've got to remember Greg Hjorth was 21 when this game was played. Nowadays that wouldn't seem extremely young. Back then that was just the start of most players' career, and he looked like he could become a world beater at this point.